These aren't the stories your mother told you. No, these are the other stories.
Today's episode of The Other Stories is Eviction, written and narrated by Andy Conduit-Turner.
This is my house. Weep for the living left behind, but weep not for the dead, for they have moved on to a much better place. I contemplate this as I lie at the bottom of the stairs. I don't remember now if it was something my dear old gran used to say, or if it was something I read, but at this point, I'm so exhausted I'm lucky to have a grasp on what day it is. I turn my attention to my surroundings and stare at the cracks and dents that mark the walls from thrown items and fallen picture frames. The damage looks worse since I stopped bothering to put things back up. Wish this prick would piss off to a better place, I grumble to no one. I wince as I move and invite new waves of pain from my recent flight from upstairs. And, with a groan, prop myself against the front door while I assess the damage. Nothing broken, but my bruises have bruises. It aches when I breathe, and I've acquired a new cut on my left forearm to add to the collection. The wound isn't deep enough to bleed freely, but the red line glows angrily. I wonder again how much longer I can keep this up. I stifle a sigh and resist the urge to scream. Spirits, especially aggressive ones, are fed by our emotions, especially fear. The spiritualist that Claire found online insisted that entities like the one assaulting us in our own home were nothing without the energy that we give them. Sadly, she had fallen short of being able to offer any surefire methods of getting rid of the miserable I threw myself back to the floor as the bowl of loose change and spare keys that lived in our hallway launched itself, or rather was launched, at my face by unseen hands. There's no such thing as ghosts, Mike. That was my brother a few weeks ago, before he stayed over to prove his point and had a pan of boiling water narrowly miss him when it was thrown across the kitchen. For a moment, I swear I can hear a throaty laugh towering over me as I cower beneath the blanket of pennies and shattered pottery. Then the usual routine begins to play out. The TV in the living room springs to life. Football highlights instantly blare obnoxiously loudly through our otherwise silent home. As usual, I hear the rhythmic creaking of a chair rocking. Frank's chair. Frank Burton, the passed-on piece of work that's been making our lives miserable for months now, is sitting in his chair in what he still perceives as his house, all while I lay beaten at the foot of the stairs. We learned Frank's name from one of the investigators who was drawn like a moth to the flame of our unexplainable trauma. Frank was one of several suspects, but he made it known to us when we got his name right. It was Claire that had used it first. The discourse online surrounding the use of a ghost's name was a mixed bag. Many considered it a great way to make a connection, while others thought of it more as provoking a response, and she certainly got the latter. It was one morning when she took a sip of coffee, only to find out milk that had been delivered only hours before had immediately gone rancid, that she called Frank by name, asking him why we couldn't live together in peace. And then just like that, he was on her. I'm not sure that I've ever felt as utterly powerless as I did on that day, running into the kitchen to see my wife being choked by someone I couldn't see and could do nothing to stop. In the end, all I could do was drag her to the back door, wrestling against thin air until we both went tumbling through the door onto the patio. We sat out there for over an hour, her neck mottled with bruises, both utterly at a loss of what we should do, when yet another piece of expert advice had failed us. That was a week ago now. Claire had been staying at her parents' since. It took 3 days to fully convince them that her injuries were nothing to do with me. So now it was just me here, until I could either find a way to end the nightmare or somehow get this place in a fit state to sell, find an escape that didn't come with financial ruin as a side dish. What I was learning so far was that the blessed salt Father Deacon had dropped round at my mother's behest had successfully kept Frank out of our bedroom, though seemingly this had only increased his aggression towards me in the other areas of the house which I had not managed to seal him out of. A cheer from the TV was accompanied by the rattling of the coffee table. and a waft of the smell of cigarette smoke. And it was at that very moment that something in me finally broke. The confusion and panic I'd been feeling for weeks were all suddenly gone, vaporized by the heat of a rage I'd been swallowing with each successive bout of abuse from our unwelcome guest. I sprang to my feet, my pain forgotten beneath a tidal wave of adrenaline. 12 paces. That was the number of steps between me and my destination. And after months of torment, hours of discussion and advice, and a lifetime of being taught to respect and fear the dead, it took only those 12 paces for me to come up with a whole new belief system for dealing with ghosts. Number 1, there probably was a better place that dead people go to, but that was only for the good ones. The most rancid and avaricious wastes of life had nothing good waiting for them, and so they would do all they could in their undead power to hang around and continue perpetually to cling to anything that passed for some form of toxic happiness from their lives. This is why, I decided, that some people get a fleeting feeling of a beloved relative looking over them at the moment they pass before they vanish from all but memory, but absolute champs like Frank, that drove away anything like a loved one from their lives by 1978, and then spent their remaining 11 years punching darts and watching United until even his own body had enough of his company, lingered on. Number 2, ghosts, like people, have very specific likes and dislikes and are susceptible to emotional responses. Number 3, while strictly not the same as physical beings, ghosts can interact physically with the world, and by extension, it should be possible to interact with them physically. In conclusion, having tried to ignore, accommodate, appease, appeal to, and ultimately exorcise Frank with no success, my final gambit was to be an attempt to evict him, physically if necessary, but principally by making an environment so hostile to his comfort that whether it was hell or oblivion that awaited him, it would start to feel far more inviting than spending another moment in my living room. "Hey Frank!" I strode into the room and fixed a glare at the empty space aggressively occupying the TV chair as the rocking stopped abruptly. No, don't get up. Absolute silence. "I think we've lived together just about long enough to afford one another some honesty, don't you, Frank?" As I continued, I picked up one of the salt containers from where it lay on the rug and casually drew a line across the threshold of the doorway with its contents. "Now, since we've lived here, you've destroyed our things, devastated our sleep, attacked us, beaten us both black and blue, driven my wife out of her home, and you show no signs of stopping. But there's one thing that you can't do." I moved across the room, placing myself between the chair and the television. "And that is block a person's view of the telly, you transparent tosser." A plastic beaker, as I'd learned to stop replacing the mugs, flew across the room and bounced impotently off my chest as the chair began to rock violently. My heart started to race with the exhilaration of this long overdue confrontation. Glancing through the open-plan room into the kitchen, I made sure that the back door was indeed open. We had taken to leaving it open for a quick escape any time it wasn't actively raining. "I've got 3 facts of death for you, Frank, and if you don't like them, there's the door." I motioned to the exit like the world's surliest air steward. "Number 1, you're dead, and this is my house now." The chair began rocking even more violently. "Number 2, in my house, we're going to start following my rules. You don't need to pass on, but if you can't leave us to live in peace, you can piss off." The sound of the TV behind me began to glitch and distort as it would in a rainstorm. "And number 3, I don't know why you insist on putting all the United games on, because they've been shit since Fergie left anyway." "There's a circus in the town. Almost mercifully, as I had no idea who United's current manager was to sing the following line about him being a clown. This was enough to send Frank into one of his trademark rages. All at once, the TV chair that he'd claimed as his own was rocked so violently that it completely tipped backwards against the living room wall, and I was immediately aware of a sudden drop in temperature as the dead man barreled into my personal space. I stumbled backwards with the force of the blow. The breath knocked out of me as though I'd just taken a plunge into icy water. As I gasped with the shock and began to come to terms with the fact that my strategy hadn't quite included how I intended to brawl with a ghost, I felt the same horrendous strangling sensation that Claire must have felt, with spectral hands clawing at her throat. The unseen fingers were so cold that they practically burned. I thrashed my hands out in front of me as I failed to strike anything. I clawed at my own throat in vain, trying to prise untouchable fingers off my windpipe as I choked and gargled. I was panicking, and it struck me that with every mote of fear I gave to Frank, the stronger his grip became. Looking down, I could almost begin to see the shape of those hideous cold fingers appearing like silhouettes at my throat. And then, before my very eyes, I could begin to see his gaunt, hideous face appear. His sunken, sleepless eyes staring through me with hatred that kept this clawing spirit from its eternal rest. Now wasn't the time for my fear to win. Looking into those pitiless eyes, I knew that my escape wouldn't be brought by hope or even love, but from an ability to instill more fear into someone that was dead than he could wring out of me.
Go ahead, finish me,
I croaked.
All you'll be doing is leveling the playing field.
A slight hesitation. The grip loosened. Glancing to my side, I saw the poker in the fireplace. Were ghosts really repelled by iron? No better time to find out. I grabbed it and swung at the shadow, now firmly visible in my otherwise hazy vision. With a thud, the shape reeled backwards. The impact was different to hitting something truly solid, but there was a force, a resistance as the bar passed through the figure. And then I saw its reaction. The hand stopped attacking, started moving defensively, as if trying to block. It was working. Again and again I swung through the shape, until it began to retreat, shrinking backwards towards the door to the hallway. As it attempted to flee through the door, there was an almighty hiss, and a muffled scream escaped from the silhouette that was simultaneously in the room with me and in another world entirely. The salt. The shadow darted towards the kitchen as I bent down to retrieve the salt pourer once again. Not so fast now, Frank. I spat into each of my hands and rubbed them together. In my half-choked, half-mad state, my spit foamed and frothed as I rubbed it between my hands and poured salt into my palms. Hands glistening with salt crystals, I marched after the figure into the kitchen, where I met those hideous eyes again hovering in the doorway. For a fleeting moment, I wondered and half hoped he would just go, but in my heart of hearts, I knew that he wouldn't. And perhaps after all this, all he'd put us through, and where we were now, I didn't really want it to end peacefully either. We charged at each other, this time both sets of our hands finding one another's throats. As he did it all to squeeze the life out of me, I tried to squeeze the death out of him. I barely felt the cold now, and where my hands gripped at Frank, he began to glow with a white light, my salt-cured fingers tingling with the electricity as he burned. We both tumbled sideways, knocking over the kitchen table as we bound each other in our respective death grips. The sound of the world around me began to muffle. All I could truly hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the pounding of my own heart. In a far-off distance, was my phone ringing? Probably Claire, begging me once again to just leave this place to the dead and give up. My vision narrowed, and all I could see were Frank's eyes locked onto mine. The hate was all still there, but I saw it now. Deep within whatever this hollow creature had that still passed for a soul, there was fear. I roared with all my final reserves of rage and breath alike, and forced my hands upwards, gripping and plunging my burning fingers into his wretched eyes. My eyes snap open and I look around the kitchen. It's cold. I instinctively turn my attention to the back door. It's closed. Morning sunshine beaming in through the window. Good. Things can finally start to warm up again in here. Someone has left a piece of half-eaten toast on a plate on the kitchen table. I contemplate finishing it off, but then come to the conclusion I'm not particularly hungry, So I toss it to the dog watching me from his basket in the corner of the room and decide to go and have a lie down to recover from my hideous ordeal. As I trudge up the stairs, it strikes me exactly how tired I am, and I glance at the photos of an unfamiliar family which line the stairwell. As I reach the top of the stairs, I remove the final photo from its hook and place it on the floor. Before I rest, I should really take down some of these old pictures and put up some of my own family. After all, this is my house.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Other Stories. Eviction was written and narrated by Andy Conduit-Turner, produced by Georgia Trentafilipoulou, with music by Epic Stock Media and Tom Robson, and sound effects provided by freesound.org and Soundly. The episode illustration was provided by Luke Spooner of Carry On House. A quick thanks to our community managers Jasmine Arch, Joshua Boucher and his eyeless ones, Mary Pastrano and Cody Czarzasty, and to Joshua Boucher for helping with our submission reading. And of course to Ben Arrington for the ongoing explosion of content he fires out of his social media canon. Andy Conduit-Turner is a writer, editor and podcaster from the UK with a love of horror across all mediums. You can find his stories featuring on several volumes of The Other Stories, his comics published by Horde Comics and more. You'll find Andy himself at AndyCT Writes on X, on the Horror Hangout podcast, discussing the best and worst of horror films, and he's standing right behind you. The Other Stories is a production of the Story Studio Hawk and Cleaver and is brought to you with a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. That means don't change it, don't sell it, but by all means share the hell out of it. Until next time.